family of origin, where you were never properly heard at the dinner table. At least that's my motivation. So it seems appropriate to talk a bit about my own history as a wine blogger, about wine bloggery in general, and perhaps also proffer some gratuitous remarks about the bizarre state of the wine industry, and then share some thoughts about where I imagine wine journalism might go, and lastly, offer a sincere cri de coeur to encourage all of you to support originality and strangeness, two features that the wine business, especially in the New World, desperately need. I got into the wine blogging business, as it were, as an outgrowth of the printed wine newsletters I used to write and mail out. At some point, someone in my organization pointed out to me the shocking dollar amount that we were spending on postage, and as a cost-cutting measure, we abruptly stopped sending out our newsletters by post. As wasteful as the newsletters were of natural resources, as carbon footprint positive as they were, and as expensive as they were to send, I'm virtually certain that we never quite communicated or connected with our customers as completely as we did in the day. Our Dune subscribers got something like 16 or 24 pages of faux Dante and faux Terza Rima, or sincere renditions of faux Kafka or Joyce or Pynchon, along with obligatory purple wine prose, gobs of ripe fruity metaphors with hints of hilarity, subtle suggestions of sarcasm, tinged with verdant notes of envy. Please don't think of me as a spy in the house of digital wine love, a turn Côte de Rhône, a Benedict Arno Roberts. If I say it was the palpable presence of the newsletters in people's mailboxes that was the important medicine, the improbable extravagance of something like a precious gift. I'm not sure precisely what lesson there is here to be learned. Maybe it is or was, despite the fact that my wines then were largely vin de fort, or confections, if you will. Perhaps it was the extravagance of the prose, coupled with the extravagance of the weighty tome in the customer's mailbox, that communicated the message that I was, on the page at least, giving my all and then some. I should also mention that at the same time we produced a minimum of 12 new and distinctive wines and labels every year for our wine club members. This was utterly crazy and impractical, and it communicated the message that we were trying harder than anyone else. This cannot count for nothing. I think of J.D. Salinger's character, Seymour Glass, who admonishes his younger brother, Zoe, to shine his shoes for the fat lady, to show up with his running lights on. So if there's perhaps an incidental takeaway in my somewhat frothy remarks, it may be this. We are living in a time of shattered attention spans, trivial to non-existent bandwidths, and communication with one another generally limited to a soundbite or a brief text message, usually taking place at a stoplight. Customer loyalty as such, indeed any kind of loyalty these days, can best charitably be described as commitment light. But the person who somehow through all of this can express an allegiance to his customers, or in your instance, to your readers, with a certain generosity of spirit, must gain our attention and maybe even respect and fidelity. In truth, it's been a tough one for me and my company. We've conditioned our customers to expect the world from us, and now, when we're only simply delivering really good wine at a fair price, along with a modest dose of piety, it's not quite enough. So what are the lessons learned? Rebranding, as they say, is a bitch. Be careful how you present yourself, especially if you're a joker, as you may eventually not be laughing quite as hard. The initial constellation of memes that surrounds your brand and public persona, especially in the days of digital immortality, will persist to the end of your days, which of course brings up the old joke about the peril of having carnal relations with just one goat. What do they call it? Myself, I'm hoping to someday become less of a cartoon, but perhaps this may be to my own detriment. I sometimes wonder if cartoons are the only things that are noticed anymore. But I don't want to go back to being a cartoon, nor am I particularly in favor of decimating forests so people can read my deathless prose. The lesson? I scratch my head every day trying to work out just what it might be. Maybe in the branded universe, you can't change things up too much. People like the wacky labels that we did and the putative, mad winemaker image. I was a Rorschach inkblot. People saw in me the person they wanted to see. As a parenthetical aside, let me tell you something that happens to me quite a bit. I do a lot of winemaker dinners, and at the end of these dinners, typically two things happen. People come up to me with a joint, because I'm from Rasta Cruz, or Santa Cruz. Alternatively, they will give me the secret libertarian handshake, absolutely convinced that I'm one of them. Because after all, I am a breaker of rules, a non-acceptor of authority, and a dedicated colorer outside the lines. In some sense, I'm a little bit like the Peter Sellers character Chance in the excellent movie Being There. Maybe this is one depressing secret for success. Allow your audience to imagine that you or your product represent what they most want it to be. My customers, at least many of my older ones, however, are not quite ready for the latest incarnation of thoughtful and measured. Thoughtful and measured doesn't go boom, boom, like some wines and winemakers go. This was a little, I actually footnote my own speeches. I don't know, this is pretty crazy. One of the footnotes that I had written was, the last remark is, I've observed a striking phenomenon, especially among certain highly successful winemakers of the Central Coast, who shall remain nameless, like Jake Lennon. The formula for success seems to be to make reasonably good wines, in whatever style you wish, and to publicly be a character, i.e., outlandish, provocative, profane, and excessive in one's remarks, facilitated, of course, by a generous consumption of one's own product. Maybe these winemakers are channeling Bacchus, the god of excess, or maybe they're just representing the thoroughly uninhibited person many of us aspire to be. In any event, I am somewhat in awe and truthfully a bit envious when I observe these characters in action. So, what are the lessons I've learned? Well, this is not exactly a lesson, it's maybe more of an observation, and maybe not even an observation so much as a kvetch. I don't like the wine business as much as I used to. It's not just the crazy amount of competition we now have and the exclusionary lowest common denominator practices of large distributors. The wine business was, at least for me and for my colleagues when we started, about possibility and discovery. We were all learning, and wine drinkers and wine writers were learning along with us. We could make mistakes and be forgiven. There was, like the World Series, always next year. There was an enormous diversity of wine styles, at least domestically, none of them obviously superior to another. The wine business and wine culture 35 or 40 years ago was a sort of Garden of Eden, relatively unspoiled. Then the next footnote is, there were still beaucoup bad wines. Think Matus, Blue Nun, and Wente Blanc de Blanc. And even dreadful Chianti that came in a fiasco, the chief virtue of which was you could put a candle in it when you were done. The known universe of wine then seemed unbounded, and this was comforting. It seemed largely knowable and navigable. Wine critics existed, of course, and their praise was useful, of course, but no one really understood then how to game the system for high point scores. It was an age of innocence, relatively speaking, where a winemaker made wine to please him or herself. winemakers, and not merely the Walter Brennan-like old coots, would say things like, I make wine to please myself. If people don't like them, your expletive here, them, I'll drink it myself. These days, nobody says that because nobody can afford to drink his own wine all by himself. It's too expensive. Modern winemakers live in an era of tragic self-consciousness about the economic consequences of their winemaking decisions, utterly aware of the peril of somehow falling outside the stylistic parameters of accepted wine styles. The principal consequence of the great success of the wine industry is that it now seems to be about business. In fact, it's all business. Great wine was not so expensive then, and anyone who entered the business as a retailer, wine writer, or winemaker did not harbor the illusion that the wine business was going to make him or her rich. We did it because it was something that we loved. But some visionary, inverted commas, individuals and companies perceived the possibility of unlimited growth and began to build wine brands and wine empires. This, coupled with the consolidation and tumescent growth of a few wine wholesale companies and mega retailers, has led to a sort of seamless virtual vertical integration of the wine business, with relatively few players controlling essentially the lion's share of the game. And this is actually a pretty good mirror of what's happened to the whole world and the whole world economy. Parenthetically, it is alternately amusing and horrifying to observe how large wine companies attempt to engage with social media. They understand well its power to influence large populations, and at the same time, understand that their message cannot be entirely controlled, which just freaks them out. The inherently random, slightly anarchic aspect of social media, which somehow recapitulates the anarchic quality of nature itself, I find incredibly appealing and sometimes horrifying. The germ of an idea, a good one or a bad one, can take root and, like kudzu, take over. The key is to keep planting useful seeds and hope that some of the more interesting and viable ones will take root. But to return to the thought about these days it all being about money, when resources become scarce or threaten to imminently become scarce, we all tend to follow the money. The few wine bloggers who are making a profitable go of it are the ones who, in some sense, are following the money, i.e., acting as trusted advisors to the wealthy individuals who don't wish to be caught not Napa-ing, sorry, and can't decide between this vintage's Screaming Harlan, Screaming Colgan, or Screaming Eagle. Forgive me, but I almost see wine bloggers, myself included, as Gene Hackman figures in The French Connection, with our noses pressed up against the restaurant window in the rain, looking in at the shady characters inside who are eating and drinking and having the time of their lives. But I didn't come here today merely to kvetch. We've established now that none of us are going to get rich doing what we do. But there's no use crying over spilled Merlot. What's dune is dune. Sorry. If we can't find monetary gain in this work, then certainly what we must do is find more meaning for ourselves and possibly even try to make something like a contribution to the larger world. So, what can I possibly say to you about wine or wine writing that has not already been said 1,000 times over? First of all, since we've established that, at least for us, it's not about money, let's then talk about beauty. What voice might we lend to illuminate wine's strange beauty? Allow me to very gently suggest, my friends, that the compilation of sensory descriptors, the shopping list of scents and schlugs, the catalogue raisonné, that's a very elegant pun, of sundry roots and berries, enumerated by urban hunter-gatherer wine writers, while amusing to read, at the end of the day, is not particularly edifying. It just presents us with the outer garment of the wine. It doesn't speak to us of its essence, that which is cloaked beneath. Whether the nose is more loganberry than boysenberry, it just doesn't really matter. In fact, I would suggest that it's not even a question of the critic finding le descriptive mot juste for the wine. It's really about something else. And I'm thinking now about J.D. Salinger again, who in his book, Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters, retold the Zen story of a simple hawker of fuel and vegetables, held by those truly in the know as being one of the greatest judge of horses in the land. One bit of evidence of this master's great gift for the appraisal of horseflesh was that he often seemed to be a bit confused about things. In fact, he was utterly indifferent as to the more obvious outer trappings of the horse's appearance and qualities, paying scarce attention to whether the equine was a sorrel mare or a bay filly. He was instead looking deeply at the horse at the level of its essence. Somehow I would suggest, dear friends, that it is the quality of deep attention paid to the wine, looking beyond the fleeting epiphenomena, that truly matters. It's believed falsely that wine is but an inert object. And the question is, how empathic of this very strange alchemical liquid can we become? The real dirty secret of wine criticism is that we are all incredibly fallible tasters, fooled just about all the time. And that our own subjective states, a function of more factors than we can imagine, time of day, air and wine temperature, fluctuation of atmospheric pressure, influence of lunar and solar phenomena, our physiological and emotional states, degree of the turbidity of the wine and degree of the turbidity of our consciousness. All these things play an important role in how a given wine presents itself to us. Instead of ignoring this inconvenient truth, I'd like to see us look at it squarely in the face and then meditate deeply on what are the implications of this knowledge. I would love to see wine criticism really turn into something more like wine phenomenology, as we look more at ourselves and what we bring to the experience, not only to the analytic skills we bring to understanding a given wine, rather to the changes that the wine is able to elicit within us. We as writers imagine that we are writing about the wines, but we are in fact always writing about ourselves. Even the descriptors we choose tell the reader far more about us, the taster, than they do about what has been tasted. What I'm suggesting is that the real opportunity for us is to think about wine as an occasion for meta-discussion. How can the experience of a wine teach us, what can the experience of a wine teach us about being human? What does it teach us about beauty? How does it help connect us with the natural world? Just as it is said that philosophy begins from the sense of awe and wonder, I would like to suggest that wine writing, or blogging, might also take its cue from the same source. Let me put it another way. It behooves us to show up for the wine. If the wine is indeed magical, let it work its magic on us. Give us supernatural powers of descriptive speech. Inspire us with synesthesia, with extravagant poetic tropes. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote that wine is bottled poetry, and we should absolutely take him at his word. Right now, we tend to imagine that the greatest wine is the most powerful wine. But I would like to see a wine that is incredibly powerful, not so much in tannin, alcohol, depth of hue and extract, but powerful in its ability to move human beings to poetic language, or just to move us to wordless wonder. On the subject of wonder, let me share with you a rather odd experience I had not too long ago. I was in Hong Kong, invited to speak at a wine conference and sit on a panel with the dueling Michels, Michel Beton and Roland, which was a little bit bizarre. And Pancho Campo had organized the conference, and this was taking place just as Pancho Gate was beginning to unfold. So this added another level of complexity to the proceedings. And Robert Parker was there, of course, and he was the real draw why people had shown up. And he was leading a Tudor tasting of his top 20 selection of magical Bordeaux from the 2009 vintage. And you can only imagine how utterly over the moon the guests were to see him. So I was imagining that hearing Robert talk about his favorite Bordeaux in Hong Kong to an adulating audience was going to be a little bit weird. But guess what? He was absolutely incredible. He spoke out in favor of elegance, and I just had to hold my seat. And he presented a bunch of wines that were absolutely undeniably elegant, except at the very end when he brought out the 15.5% Cosesternat. But what was most remarkable was that Parker himself, despite his jet lag and still recovering from his surgeries, was incredibly passionate and animated in his presentation. He spoke from a position of humble reverence, sincerely grateful to have been given the opportunity to taste these remarkable wines. In some sense, you could say that he was the least jaded palate in the room. He was really something. He allowed the wines to nourish him and inspire him, and this is a lesson we can all take away. There is still a tremendous amount of work to be done. We have to recover our curiosity and recharge our passion, or find it in the first place, for the wines that rock our world. And most importantly, we have to discover or create a language that will translate beyond our own private solipsistic sensorium and connect to the life experience of our readership. Ideally, a readership still in the process of discovery. We, who are utterly wine immersed, thoroughly macerated, you might say, tend to live in something like a fairly self-referential universe, if we haven't noticed. A thorny problem: how to allow the ripples to spread to a wider readership without diluting the message and rendering it banal. Here's a crazy idea: pay more attention to the language. It's language, after all, that we're trading in. We can't, as much as we might want to,